Last month, I bought back the 1987 Buick LeSabre my parents sold 15 years ago. They needed the money for my dad's medical bills after his stroke. I found it listed on Facebook Marketplace in Akron, Ohio, just 2 hours from our old house in Cleveland. The seller had no idea he was talking to the kid who used to ride in that back seat every Sunday to St. Augustine's. I drove it home feeling nostalgic, remembering family road trips to Cedar Point and arguments over the radio station. But when I was cleaning out the interior, my hand hit something wedged deep under the driver's seat. A manila envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a letter dated 3 days before my high school graduation in 2009. The letterhead read, Cuyahoga County Child Services. As I read those typed lines, my stomach dropped. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about why we always struggled with money, why my parents fought behind closed doors, why my dad drank too much after work, suddenly made sense. But it also meant that for 18 years, I'd been living a lie. The letter contained information about monthly payments my parents had been receiving. Payments that were supposed to stop when I turned 18. Payments they'd been hiding from me my entire life. The revelation explained so much about our family dynamics, but it also raised a question that would haunt me. How long had they planned to keep the secret? What I found in that car didn't just change how I saw my past. It gave me the power to rewrite my future. But first, I had to decide whether to confront them at my nephew's upcoming communion party, where the whole extended family would be gathered. Sometimes the truth has perfect timing, and sometimes you have to create that timing yourself. This is the story of how a $40 Facebook find led me to discover the truth that my parents spent decades hiding. Growing up in Cleveland's Slavic Village neighborhood, our family looked normal from the outside. My dad, Frank Kowalski, worked at the Ford plant in Brook Park. My mom, Carol, cleaned houses for families in Shaker Heights. We lived in a narrow 2-story house with aluminum siding and a postage stamp yard, just like everyone else on East 65th Street. But our normal had cracks that showed if you looked close enough. Dad came home every night smelling like Budweiser and machine oil. Mom counted grocery money twice before leaving for the store. And there were always hushed phone conversations that stopped when I walked into the room. The Kowalski family dynamics revolved around my father's explosive temper and my mother's desperate attempts to keep peace. Dad ruled our dinner table like a tyrannical supervisor, criticizing everything from my posture to my grades to the way I held my fork. Mom would shoot me warning looks that said, "Don't make it worse," but I was just a kid trying to figure out why nothing I did was ever good enough. My most vivid memory of humiliation happened during 8th grade parent-teacher conferences. Mrs. Henderson had called my parents in to discuss my attitude problem. Basically, I'd been talking back to my math teacher. Dad showed up still wearing his work uniform, grease under his fingernails, reeking of beer. He spent 20 minutes loudly berating me in front of my teacher, calling me ungrateful and lazy, his voice echoing down the hallway where other families could hear. "You think you're better than us?" he shouted, his face red. "Think you're too good for this family?" Mrs. Henderson tried to intervene, but Dad kept going. "We sacrifice everything for you, and this is how you repay us?" I sat there burning with shame, watching other kids, parents glance through the doorway with pity and disgust. That night, I heard Mom crying in their bedroom and Dad yelling about how I was making them look like trash. The second incident happened my junior year when I brought my girlfriend Sarah home for dinner. We'd been dating for 6 months, and I'd finally worked up the courage to introduce her to my family. Sarah came from Beechwood, her dad was a lawyer, her mom taught at Case Western. She was smart, kind, and way out of my league, but somehow she liked me. Dad spent the entire meal making inappropriate comments about Sarah's appearance and asking invasive questions about her family's money. When she mentioned her parents' lake house in Geneva, he laughed bitterly. "Must be nice," he said, "having rich parents who can buy you whatever you want." The discomfort was suffocating. Mom kept apologizing and trying to change the subject, but Dad seemed determined to embarrass all of us. After Sarah left, Dad cornered me in the kitchen. "Girls like that don't stick around," he said. "Soon as she figures out what kind of family you really come from, she'll dump you for some preppy kid with a trust fund." His words stung because part of me worried he was right. But here's what made the letter I found so shocking. Throughout all those years of struggling and humiliation, my parents had been receiving monthly payments of $1,200 from the county. Foster care payments. The letter detailed how these payments were meant to cover my expenses, food, clothing, medical care, school supplies. Payments they'd been pocketing while telling me we couldn't afford new clothes for school or money for class trips. The grand gesture I'd always remembered was Dad surprising me with a used Nintendo for Christmas my sophomore year. I thought it meant he actually cared about making me happy. Now I realized it was probably bought with money that was supposed to be mine anyway. The secret the letter revealed was that I'd been in foster care my entire life. Carol and Frank Kowalski weren't my biological parents, they were my foster parents, paid by the state to take care of me. And somehow, they'd managed to hide this fact from me for 18 years, collecting money meant for my care while making me feel like a burden they could barely afford to keep. Let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. I'm curious how many people have discovered family secrets that completely changed their understanding of their childhood. The revelation explained everything. The secrecy, the resentment, the constant financial stress despite having two incomes. They weren't struggling to support their son, they were struggling to maintain a lie while profiting from it. 3 weeks after finding the letter, my sister-in-law Jennifer called about my nephew Tommy's first communion party. Jennifer married my older brother Mike, who I now realized was also a foster kid, though he'd aged out of the system before I was old enough to understand. The party was being held at the Polish American Cultural Center on Fleet Avenue, the same hall where we'd celebrated every major family milestone for the past 20 years. "Your parents are so excited," Jennifer said on the phone. "Your dad's been telling everyone how proud he is that Tommy's taking his first sacrament at St. Stanislaus, just like you boys did." The irony wasn't lost on me. Dad taking credit for raising Catholic boys when he'd basically been a paid caretaker collecting government checks. I spent 2 weeks debating whether to go. The letter sat on my kitchen counter like a loaded gun, and every time I looked at it, my anger grew. But I also felt curious about how they'd react when confronted with the truth. Would they deny it? Make excuses? Try to gaslight me into thinking I was wrong? The morning of the party, I tucked the letter into my jacket pocket and drove to Parma, where the cultural center sat between a pierogi shop and a check-cashing place. The parking lot was already full of familiar faces, aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who'd watched me grow up thinking they knew my story. Inside, the hall buzzed with typical Polish-American celebration energy. Accordion music played over the sound system while kids ran between tables covered in red and white checkered tablecloths. The smell of kielbasa and sauerkraut filled the air, and folding tables groaned under the weight of pierogi, gołąbki, and enough beer to float a small boat. Tommy looked adorable in his tiny white suit, clutching his prayer book like a trophy. At 7 years old, he had no idea he was about to witness family drama that would become legendary in our neighborhood. Jennifer had decorated his table with photos from the ceremony that morning at St. Stanislaus, the same church where I'd made my communion, confirmation, and served as an altar boy for 3 years. Dad held court near the bar, wearing his best shirt and the cologne Mom bought him every Christmas. He was in full performance mode, slapping backs and telling stories about Tommy's resemblance to Mike at that age. "That boy's a real Kowalski," he announced to anyone who'd listen. "Got the family spirit." Mom fluttered around the dessert table, arranging homemade krasiki and store-bought cake, accepting compliments on her dress, a navy blue number she'd probably owned for a decade. She looked nervous, but I thought it was typical party anxiety. I had no idea she was about to have her worst nightmare come true. The tension started building when my cousin Danny asked about my new car. "Heard you bought back the old Buick," he said, cracking open a Budweiser. "Find any buried treasure in there?" He was joking, but Dad's head snapped up from across the room like a radar dish picking up a signal. "What's this about the car?" Dad walked over, his voice carrying that edge I remembered from childhood. "You went through the whole thing?" I met his eyes steadily. "Just cleaning it out, Dad. You know how it is when you buy a used car. Never know what the previous owners left behind." The color drained from his face. Mom appeared beside him like she'd been summoned, her smile frozen in place. "That's nice, honey. she said in her fake cheerful voice. I'm sure it brought back memories. Oh, it definitely did, I replied. Some I expected, some I didn't. Uncle Stan chose that moment to interrupt with a toast to Tommy, and the crowd turned their attention to the guest of honor. But I caught the look that passed between my parents, a silent communication that screamed panic. They knew. They absolutely knew what I'd found. As the afternoon wore on, I watched them with new eyes. Dad's jovial performance seemed forced now, and Mom kept glancing at me like I might explode at any moment. During dinner, when Father Kowalczyk from St. Stanislaus said grace and thanked God for families who stay together through thick and thin, I nearly laughed out loud. The breaking point came when Jennifer asked me to say a few words about Tommy's achievement. As I stood up with my beer raised, looking out at 3 generations of extended family and family friends, I realized this was the perfect moment. Everyone was here, all the people who'd watched me grow up, who'd heard Dad's stories about sacrifice and hard work, who'd witnessed my years of struggling to live up to impossible expectations. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and hit that like button to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your support means everything. Tommy was opening his communion gifts at the head table, surrounded by love and celebration. In a few minutes, that innocence would be shattered, but sometimes the truth can't wait for a more convenient time. I pulled the letter from my jacket pocket and unfolded it slowly, letting the silence build as everyone waited for my toast. Before I toast Tommy, I said, holding up the yellowed envelope, I want to share something I recently discovered about family and truth. The room fell silent except for the accordion music still playing softly in the background. Tommy stopped unwrapping his gifts, sensing the shift in energy. Dad's beer bottle froze halfway to his lips. 3 weeks ago, I found this letter wedged under the driver's seat of our old Buick. I pulled out the document, my voice carrying clearly across the hall. It's from Cuyahoga County Child Services, dated May 15, 2009. 3 days before my high school graduation. Mom's face went white as communion wafer. She grabbed Dad's arm, her knuckles showing through her skin. The letter details foster care payments of $1,200 per month that Frank and Carol Kowalski had been receiving for my care since I was 6 months old. My voice stayed steady, but inside I was shaking. Payments that were scheduled to end when I turned 18. Uncle Stan set down his pierogi fork. Aunt Helen's mouth fell open. The kids kept playing, but every adult in that room was riveted. For 17.5 years, while I watched my parents struggle to pay bills, while I wore secondhand clothes and skipped school trips because we couldn't afford it, they were collecting over $1,400 a month from the state to take care of me. Jennifer covered her mouth with her hands. My brother Mike looked like he'd been punched in the stomach, probably realizing this explained so much about his own childhood too. Dad finally found his voice. Danny, sit down. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I waved the letter. Because this document is pretty specific. It mentions my case number, my biological mother's name, Lisa Marie Rodriguez, and the circumstances of my placement. It also mentions that the Kowalskis were required to inform me of my foster status by age 16. The accordion music had stopped. Even the bartender was listening now. 17 years, I continued, my voice getting stronger. 17 years of making me feel like a burden while you cashed checks meant for my care. 17 years of yelling at me for being ungrateful when I was literally paying my own way through foster care payments you kept secret. Mom started crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of a woman whose con had been exposed. Danny, please, she whispered. Not here. Not like this. When would be better, Carol? I used her first name deliberately. When were you planning to tell me? Ever. Dad stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. You ungrateful little, no. I cut him off, and for the first time in my life, he didn't continue. I'm done being ungrateful for lies. I'm done feeling bad for not being the perfect son to people who were literally paid to pretend to love me. Father Kowalczyk cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps this conversation should continue privately. Why? I turned to face the priest. So they can spin another story? So they can convince me I misunderstood? These people stood in your church for 18 years and lied about who I was. They collected communion gifts for me, confirmation gifts, graduation gifts, all while hiding the fact that I wasn't even really part of this family. Tommy started crying. Jennifer scooped him up and headed for the door, along with several other families with young children. But most of the adults stayed, transfixed by the drama unfolding. Dad's face had gone from white to red to purple. "You want the truth?" he shouted. "Fine. Your real mother was a drug addict who abandoned you in a hospital. We saved you. We gave you a home. You gave me a lie." I shouted back. "And you got paid well for it." "We didn't do it for the money." "Then where did the money go, Frank?" "Because it sure didn't go to feeding me, clothing me, or making me feel wanted." I folded the letter and put it back in my pocket. You want to know what's really ungrateful? Taking money meant for a child's care and then making that child feel guilty for existing. The room was dead silent now. Even Dad seemed to realize he'd lost control of the narrative. "I'm leaving," I announced. "Tommy, buddy, I'm sorry your party got ruined. When you're older, maybe your parents will tell you the truth about family, how it's supposed to be built on honesty, not monthly payments." I walked toward the exit, but stopped at my parents' table. The car's paid off now, so I guess the circle is complete. Except this time, I know exactly what I'm buying. As I pushed through the double doors into the parking lot, I could hear the explosion of voices behind me, people demanding explanations, Mom sobbing, Dad yelling at anyone who'd listen. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't staying to clean up their mess. I got in the Buick and drove away from the Polish-American Cultural Center, leaving behind 18 years of lies and the family that had never really been mine. The aftermath was swift and brutal. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing with calls and texts. Uncle Stan wanted the real story. Aunt Helen was demanding I apologize immediately. Cousin Danny sent a simple message, "Holy shit, dude." But the call that mattered came from my brother Mike at 11 p.m. that night. His voice was shaky when I answered. "I need to see that letter," he said without preamble. "Because if what you said is true, it explains everything about my childhood too." Mike came over the next morning with Jennifer and Tommy. While the adults talked in the kitchen, Tommy played with my Xbox, blissfully unaware that his communion party had become neighborhood legend overnight. Mike studied the letter for 20 minutes, cross-referencing details with his own fragmented memories. "I aged out when I was 18, he said finally. "They told me I had to leave because they couldn't afford to keep supporting me. But if they were getting foster payments for you..." He trailed off, doing the math. Jennifer, who'd been quiet until then, spoke up. "That's why your dad was always so bitter about money. He was mad that the payments stopped for Mike, and he knew they'd stop for you too." Over the next few days, the three of us became amateur investigators. Mike remembered overheard phone conversations about caseworkers and monthly reports. He recalled Dad's panic whenever official-looking mail arrived. We realized that what we'd interpreted as normal parental stress was actually the constant fear of being caught in a massive deception. The breakthrough came when Jennifer suggested we contact Cuyahoga County directly. As adults, we had the right to access our own records. The social worker who met with us, Mrs. Patricia Williams, had been working in the system for 30 years and remembered our case. "The Kowalskis were good foster parents on paper," she explained in her cramped office downtown. "They passed all inspections, filed required reports, attended mandatory meetings. But looking back, there were red flags we should have caught." She pulled out thick files for both Mike and me. What we learned was staggering. We weren't just random foster placements, we were part of what Mrs. Williams called the professional foster situation. The Kowalskis had been taking in kids for nearly 15 years, almost always boys between infancy and age 6. They specialized in long-term placements, she continued. Kids who needed stability but weren't likely to be reunified with biological families. It provided steady income with relatively low risk of disruption. The files revealed that over the years, Frank and Carol had fostered 7 children total. Mike and I were the only ones who stayed until 18. The others had been moved to different placements for various reasons, behavioral issues, personality conflicts, or what the records diplomatically called, incompatibility with the foster family's expectations. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Mrs. Williams hesitated before sharing the final piece of information. "There's something else," she said. "Your biological mother, Lisa Rodriguez, she didn't abandon you, Danny. She died in a car accident when you were 8 months old. You were placed in emergency care, and the Kowalskis volunteered for permanent placement." The room spun. Everything Dad had screamed at the communion party, about my mother being a drug addict who abandoned me, had been another lie. My real mother was Maria Elena Rodriguez, a 19-year-old college student who'd been driving home from her job at university hospitals when a drunk driver ran a red light. Mrs. Williams handed me a photo from the file. A young Latina woman with dark hair and bright eyes, wearing scrubs and smiling at the camera. She looked like someone who would have sung to me, read me stories, fought for my future. Someone who would have told me the truth about who I was. "She was studying to be a nurse," Mrs. Williams added gently. "According to the records, she had plans to raise you as a single mother. Her family in Puerto Rico wanted to take you, but there were complications with interstate custody laws, and by the time everything was sorted out, you were already settled with the Kowalskis. I had a grandmother in San Juan who might still be alive. Possibly aunts, uncles, cousins who shared my DNA and might want to know me. An entire family history that Frank and Carol had stolen from me along with everything else. The healing process was slow and complicated. I started therapy with Dr. Sarah Mendez, a counselor who specialized in adult adoptees and foster care trauma. She helped me understand that my anger was justified, but that carrying it forever would only hurt me. "You're allowed to grieve," she told me during one session. "You're grieving the childhood you should have had, the parents you should have known, the truth you deserved. That's not something you get over, it's something you integrate." Mike and I grew closer than we'd ever been. We had weekly dinners where we processed our shared experience and planned our next steps. Jennifer became an unexpected ally, helping us research our legal options and providing emotional support when the anger threatened to overwhelm us. The grand gesture, Dad's Nintendo gift, took on new meaning when we discovered it had been purchased with my own foster care money. But instead of bitterness, I felt a strange kind of freedom. Every manipulation, every guilt trip, every moment of manufactured financial stress had been an elaborate performance funded by the state. 3 months after the communion party confrontation, I received an unexpected phone call. A woman with a slight Puerto Rican accent introduced herself as Carmen Rodriguez, my biological grandmother. "Me, Joe," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've been looking for you for 20 years. The unexpected twist was that she'd never stopped trying to find me. After my mother's death, the family had fought the placement, but legal complications and language barriers had worked against them. When I aged out of foster care, the paper trail went cold. It was only when Mike and I contacted Child Services that our case was flagged in the system, triggering a notification to relatives who'd requested updates. I flew to San Juan 2 weeks later. Walking into Carmen's house felt like stepping into an alternate universe where I belonged. Photos of my mother covered the walls, graduation pictures, childhood snapshots, images of her holding me as a baby during visits before she died. I had her eyes, her smile, her stubborn chin. "She wanted to name you Diego," Carmen told me, showing me a journal my mother had kept during her pregnancy. "She wrote about all her dreams for you, how she'd teach you Spanish, take you to the beach, make sure you knew your culture." For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't an outsider looking in on someone else's family. I was home. It's been 8 months since I found that letter under the seat of a $40 Buick, and my life looks completely different now. I'm learning Spanish from my abuela Carmen through weekly video calls. I've connected with 12 cousins scattered across Puerto Rico, New York, and Florida. Last month, I visited my mother's grave for the first time and left flowers, yellow roses, which Carmen told me were her favorites. Frank and Carol never apologized. They've told anyone who'll listen that I'm ungrateful and vindictive, that they saved me from the system and deserved compensation for their sacrifice. A few family members have sided with them, but most people can see through the manipulation now. Mike and I have built our own definition of family, one based on truth, choice, and genuine care. The hardest lesson I've learned is that not every story has a villain. Frank and Carol weren't evil people who set out to harm children. They were two working-class people who found a way to make extra money by providing care to kids who needed it. But somewhere along the way, they convinced themselves that hiding the truth was protecting me, when really they were protecting themselves. I still drive that Buick. It reminds me that sometimes the things we think we've lost forever can come back to us in unexpected ways, carrying gifts we never imagined. That car didn't just give me transportation, it gave me back my identity, my real family, and most importantly, the truth about who I am. If you're watching this and you've discovered family secrets that changed everything you thought you knew about yourself, know that you're not alone. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and when it does, you get to decide what to do with it. You can let it destroy you, or you can let it rebuild you into someone stronger. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you're meant to have. And sometimes finding out the truth about your past is the first step toward creating the future you actually want. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who might need to hear that families built on lies aren't real families at all, and that it's never too late to find where you truly belong. Thanks for listening to my story, and I'll see you in the next video.